Michael Irons, Worlds Old and New, by Nathan Moore. Chapter 20, Salt and Fire. It had been some time, more than a year at least, since Michael Irons had even scented ocean air. The thick, salted odor lay heavy, made almost tangible by the cold humidity, inclining metals to rust in rapid fashion. Aesthetic considerations and comfort aside, it was Irons' intent, having now arrived at the New World's western coast, to turn north and seek port. That, he understood, was where most niches had been carved into the wilderness, supporting the burgeoning fur trade. Where he would go from there was inconsequential. As always, it would as God willed. After a time, Michael Irons did come upon a fort flying a Spanish flag. As with nearly all forts on this coast, it was little more than a trade outpost, though this one had been marginally expanded to act as an impromptu trade hub, thus receiving furs from secondary forts, collating and tallying totals before eventually loading them onto trade ships, from which they would also offload supplies to be distributed to those satellite forts. Depending on how the various treaties and postures toward war with the British proceeded, to say nothing of the Southern Territory's inclinations towards independence, the region might not remain under Spain's purview much longer. But for now, the Red Cross of Burgundy still flew proud above the fortified trade repository, its walls an oddly sleepy sight nestled into thick, damp pine woods, inspiring in Irons an oddly acute pang of nostalgia for the northern coasts of England. What few soldiers stood watch about the trapper camp's exterior to the fort were understandably surprised to receive Michael Irons. A wanderer not of Spain and bearing no furs was an uncanny sight indeed, and Irons assumed they would keep an eye on him as a potential spy. Nights on temperate coasts were a chilled affair, made more so by the residual moisture in the air, something which assured any who slept outdoors or in tents would awaken under a slick, damp film. For Irons, it was another reminder of home. Over a few days, Irons helped about the camp as he was able, often in wood gathering and hunting. Then, one night, he woke suddenly from a dark dream. Uncertain as to what had roused him, Irons nevertheless found his body already tense and prepared for battle. This was enough for him to take precautionary action. His sword and pistol brace in possession, he crept to the outskirts of camp into the cover of trees in the night's darkness. There he crouched beneath a great pine, head slightly off-center on both axes, like an owl listening. A low wind blew in from the ocean, deadening what might be heard from further inland, while carrying the heavy rhythmic constant of the surf. For what felt like maddening minutes, Irons crouched, then knelt under the tree, eyes searching the dark, the camp, the shore, ears trying to parse what they may from the ever-active ambiance. The movement Irons managed to notice was so subtle most men might not have seen, even had their eye been upon the space. That alone made Irons first assume it were a native brave in concealment, intending to steal a horse or otherwise fulfill some warrior tradition. However, this thought was discarded before it even fully formed, for he noticed the movement seemed to float. A glance at where a body's bent knees might be, Irons saw no disturbance in the tall coastal grasses, despite the form's passage. Irons put away his sword and pistols, and began to instead ready salt and iron crucifix, though he remained troubled at the predicament ghosts posed. Permanent banishment of a spectre required either the fulfillment of a task unfinished in life, or for the spirit's remains to be burned, and in such an untamed land, the discovery of either was a near impossibility. On cautious, silent step, Irons began to follow the spirit, growing more at ease as he progressed. Ghosts, in his experience, were either wrathful or lost. The former did not wander from their haunt, and tended toward wailing and blindly hunting the living, while lost souls, as the name implied, were simply lost, and sometimes, were the death recent, One might even manage communications. "Good evening to you." Irons spoke in a low voice, his tools away and a cautious hand raised in greeting. The spirit stopped and turned toward him. It seemed, now that he had a decent view, to have been female, and still retained a reasonably whole approximation of its former form, though the features were indistinct. It regarded him for several moments, perhaps hearing him poorly, likely not seeing him, then turned back on its previous path and moved towards the fort. Iron's mind tried to parse possibilities for a lost dead woman, but he decided he would need to focus on the now. Perhaps she had died this very night and was in the process of passing. In an effort to determine where the spirit was directed, he moved ahead of her apparent path, eventually arriving at the fort's wall. Before he was able to quietly call to a guard, the spirit passed through the wooden barrier, and then a scream. A woman's scream so near, Irons looked over his shoulder as he clamped his hands on his ears, but no one else was present, and the sound assaulted his ears despite the obstruction, so immediate it felt as if it were rattling his brain. Within the same instant, there began screams from within the fort, the sounds of men crying out in horrific pain and senseless terror. Irons reeled away from the wall, and upon stumbling 10 steps, the scream in his head ceased, but the chorus of wails from the fort remained. Around him the camp came to life as the handful of trappers and tradesmen present emerged from their tent, most armed to the teeth, assuming they were under Indian attack. Then, before any action could be made, there came the sound of shattering glass, followed soon by a great gout of flame, which belched above the walls of the fort. For several seconds the fire blossomed higher and higher, then, to the astonishment of Irons, seemed to bloat and expand until even the fort's walls were engulfed. What screams of agony persisted now swiftly ended, and at that moment the unholy explosion faded away like any other into flames, leaving behind an all-encompassing but mortal inferno to consume the fort. Irons leapt to action with several of the trappers to get buckets of water, not to try and subjugate the persistent flames, for they were well beyond them, but to soak the perimeter so the fire could not claim further territory. The effort lasted for nearly an hour of hard labor, after which all involved patrolled the perimeter, stomping and splashing any tongues of flame which reached out from the fort. It was well after midnight when enough of the fort collapsed and the fire subsided that they could begin to douse the angry embers. By then, what shock and fear had jolted all into wakefulness had worn well beyond its course, and, after organizing a rough watch schedule, those involved began to return to their bunks and bedrolls in shifts. Dawn began to grow meekly through the heavy morning mist. Irons patrolled the fort's remains in search of even an inclination about what happened, while others sifted for salvage, for while the danger had passed, it was clear that almost all supplies and trade goods stored in the fort had been lost. While the trapping season was still early, the loss remained a deep cut. "Bad luck it was." Irons overheard a trapper grumble to another, "what they did to that woman." The other nodded, a sour expression under his beard. "Bad luck all round." Satisfied with what he had heard, and disinclined to question after the dead, Irons made himself useful in the camp until, 2 weeks later, a ship flying the Union Jack anchored off the coast, having noticed the fort's disappearance. Irons, grateful to hear his native tongue for the first time in almost a year, took the British vessel as a sign of providence and, after some negotiation, was able to secure passage in exchange for his services as a sailor, caring not whither the ship was bound.